Most people don't mind wearing a uniform. What people mind is when they discover they can never take it off. Every workplace asks us to adapt. That's part of having a job. We learn the culture, the expectations, and the unwritten rules. Most of us understand that. Today, I want to talk about how some workplaces stopped asking us to adapt and started asking us to become someone else entirely. Hi, I'm Dr. Theresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Think Differently. Today, I want to talk about the price of acculturation, what that means, and how some conformity is necessary while other requirements to be like everyone else are actually quite harmful. And to start this conversation, I'd like to bring you along and have you think about the last time you worked a job where you wore a uniform. Maybe it was fast food service, maybe it was at a theme park. You put on the clothes, you learned the script, and at the end of the shift, you took it all off. You went home, you were still you. Nobody expected the McDonald's voice to follow you into your living room. That's called adaptation, and that's working the way it's supposed to. Researchers would call it acculturation. In short, you adapt at work, but your identity doesn't get erased by work. I honestly believe that every workplace has a costume. You put it on when you come to work, and ideally, you get to take it off when you go home. But today, I want to talk about what happens when that stops being true. When there's no costume to take off because what's being asked of you isn't act this way for 8 hours, but become this person, full stop. I don't think professionalism is the problem. I do think we've confused professionalism with identity. I call that toxic acculturation. And I think a lot of us, especially neurodivergent people, are living inside it without a name and what's actually happening to us. So there was a time, a long time ago for me, that I was a bank teller in my early 20s. And at that age, I was known to use some foul language with my friends and even around some of my family. However, I never swore at work. I was completely polite and professional in that teller window. Looking back, there was a clear work self and an everyday self. And it wasn't me being inauthentic. I wasn't losing myself. That was me putting on a costume for 8 hours, speaking politely and professionally, and then taking off that persona when I left the door. The behavior changed, but I didn't as an individual. That's what a lot of workplace norms are when you strip them down. A costume, dress codes, professional tone, customer scripts, meeting norms. You put it on for the job. You take it off when the job ends. Nobody's confused about who you really are underneath all of that. Toxic acculturation is what happens when there's no costume option. When the job doesn't want you to perform a version of yourself for 8 hours, it wants you to become that version all the time, not just at work. And I want to reiterate that I don't think professionalism is a problem. I think we've confused professionalism with identity alignment. And I want to be really clear about something because I think this is where a lot of bring your whole self to work conversations get tangled up. I don't think you should have to hide who you are. I genuinely believe that. But I also live the version where who I am at work and who I am, we're allowed to be two slightly different, both true things. And I think we've lost the language for that middle ground. It's gotten flattened into two bad options: hide everything or expose everything. Nobody's talking about the in-between. So, how do you know the difference? When a workplace norm is legitimate, something you can put on and take off without it costing you anything real, and when is it actually asking you to change who you are? I used to think there was a clean test. Can whoever's enforcing this norm tell you why? A real functional reason? Or can they only tell you it looks unprofessional? If it's a functional reason, it's probably a costume. If it's just aesthetic, it's probably regulating who you are, not what you're doing. Except the more that I've thought about it, the less convinced I am that it's that simple. Take doctors wearing white coats. Patients need to know who's providing clinical care, so there's a practical reason for them, and they're easier to clean. But white coats also communicate authority, which is why non-clinical hospital staff sometimes wear them too. The function and the appearance blend together, and you can't always cleanly separate them. So now I find myself asking two different questions instead. First, is there a real purpose behind this expectation, or is it just inherited preference dressed up as a standard? The second is, what actually happens if someone doesn't follow it? Because those aren't the same question. And there's a trap here. We want to believe that if something isn't legitimate, it shouldn't cost us anything. We think that's not fair, so it shouldn't matter. And yet, it still might matter. For example, blue hair should not affect whether a client trusts you. However, in a specific room with a specific manager on a specific day, it still might. Both of those things can be true at the same time, and pretending they're not is how people get blindsided with unfortunate outcomes. I don't say that because I think it's right. I say it because I think we do people a disservice when we confuse how the world should work with how it sometimes works. If we're serious about changing workplace culture, we have to be honest enough to recognize both. And I want to briefly talk about hair for a moment because it's the clearest version of everything I just said. Black employees fighting for the right to wear braids and locks and twists to work and winning that fight, which is why we have the Crown Act in many states. That's a legitimacy fight with a zero on one side. There was never a functional reason those hairstyles weren't professional. Nothing. It was a preference for companies and leaders to have straight, Eurocentric hair textures coded as neutral and professional, dressed up as a standard and enforced with real consequences. People were sent home, people were passed over, those consequences were documented, litigated, they are very real. And here's my but, and I hate there's a but. Even where the law has caught up, even where the legitimacy question is settled, the consequences don't necessarily disappear overnight. That gap between what's legitimate and what still costs you doesn't close the day a law changes. It's room by room, manager by manager. I don't think we do anyone any favors by pretending the fight is over simply because the law changed, because we can see what's right and wrong. The principle is caught up. Reality and execution is still catching up. This is why I don't think acculturation is the right word for what happened to Black employees and their hair. That was never adapt your behavior for a shared purpose. It was you need to erase this marker of who you are so you resemble the dominant culture with your paycheck as leverage. That's not a costume. That is something else entirely. And I think it's one of the clearest examples of what I'm calling toxic acculturation. Here's why I can't talk about this in the abstract for long. And this is where my actual work begins. Go back to the costume. The reason it works for most people is that the behavior and the self are separable enough to switch back and forth without anything breaking. You can hold eye contact for an interview, do the small talk, run the script. It costs you something, but it's reversible. You can put it down at the end of the day and walk away. For a lot of neurodivergent people, the specific things labeled just professional norms, sustained eye contact, neurotypical conversational rhythms, reading unspoken social cues, suppressing stims, performing a flat or more appropriate affect, aren't a costume on the top of the shelf. They're either not accessible the way they are for others, or they're only accessible through sustained, effortful masking. From the outside, two people might look like they're doing the same thing. One person is making small talk because it's part of the job. The other person is consciously calculating every facial expression, every pause, every moment of eye contact, trying to make sure they don't come across as wrong, waiting long enough, speaking long enough. The behavior may look identical on the outside, but the experience of execution couldn't be more different. And masking that intensely doesn't switch off at 5 o'clock. It's not reversible the way a McDonald's voice is reversible. The research on camouflaging backs this up. Chronic masking is linked to burnout, anxiety, and delayed diagnoses, especially for people who learn to mask early. So the same rule, which is also ambiguous, act professional, gets applied to two different people at wildly different costs. For one person, it's just a costume. For another, it is a sustained performance of neurotypicality itself, held up by a continuous effort with no backstage moment where it comes off cleanly. The energy expenditure is not the same. Now, if I'm going to criticize toxic acculturation, I think I also have to be clear about what I'm advocating for, because I don't believe the answer is to eliminate workplace expectations. Jobs are still jobs. Every organization has a culture. Every team has norms. Every profession asks us to adapt in some way, and I don't think that's inherently a bad thing. The question isn't whether people should adapt. The question is what we're asking them to adapt to. Are we asking people to meet expectations that genuinely help them do the work? Or are we asking them to look, sound, and behave like the people who came before them simply because that's what we're used to doing? I think a healthy workplace culture spends more time asking what actually matters here. Does someone need to maintain eye contact to build trust, or do they need to communicate clearly? Does someone need to socialize exactly like everyone else, or do they need to collaborate effectively? Does someone need to perform professionalism in a very specific way, or do they need to do excellent work while treating people with respect? Those aren't the same questions. And to me, that's the difference between healthy acculturation and toxic acculturation. Healthy workplace cultures ask people to adapt to the work. Toxic workplace cultures ask people to adapt to an identity. That's the line I think we've learned, and it's the line I think we need to find again. So if there's one thing I want you to walk away with, it's this. Every workplace has a costume. That's not the problem. The problem isn't adapting to a workplace. The problem is when adapting quietly becomes becoming the workplace, when the costume stops being something you wear and starts becoming someone you're expected to be. I don't think professionalism is a problem. I think we've confused it with identity alignment. Jobs are jobs. There will always be expectations. There will always be norms. But I think we owe it to ourselves and to each other to keep asking whether those expectations are helping people do their best work, or simply asking them to look and act like everyone else, because those aren't the same thing. For some people, going to work is just putting on a costume, and they can take it off every night, and nothing about who they are fundamentally changed. For others, especially many neurodivergent people, the costume was never designed to fit them, and they're asked to wear it anyway and then blamed when it doesn't fit right. That's not a failure of the person, that's a failure of the costume design. Maybe the conversation we should be having isn't whether people are professional enough or whether they fit our cultures. Maybe the better question is whether we're measuring professionalism or simply rewarding conformity. Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank AudioWorks Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.